Good morning, everybody. So in a funny bit of serendipitous coordination, I was going to begin by stating affirmatively and confidently that how we build housing and how we make housing more affordable for not just those with some, but for those most importantly with a lot less than some, is the most important policy challenge that we have in America's cities, in particular. And I think that challenge also transfers to being, if not the most important, then one of the most important challenges that this country faces overall. And of course, Mayor Steinberg challenged us, I think, to think a little bit more critically and concretely about for whom and why this challenge is actually as important as many of us say we think it is. And so I think, I hope that certainly after you leave here, you have been propagandized to believe exactly what we want you to believe, that this is indeed the most important challenge that we face and the thing that we all need to continue to put our heads around to solve. But of course, I leave that decision to you. But I think the first piece we need to, one of the first things we need to absorb and experience is the lessons from other places in terms of getting to a better housing production place. And we have invited some very important guests from Spokane, from Portland, to give us some of those lessons. So as Mayor Steinberg mentioned, we have these two sides of the ledger, right? We've got this 8.5 by 11. We got on one side, we have this priority where we feel like we need to chart a new course on housing and land use. We want to plan for much more housing production. Those are the kind of goals that we're setting. The easy part, I think, if you talk to the typical voter, the typical resident, are all the things on the right side of the paper, which are the challenges that we need to overcome. And these challenges are, of course, not unique to Southern California at all. We didn't invent these challenges. We didn't, maybe we've gotten better at, putting those challenges in front of us than other places, but they are not unique to us. And we hope to learn from our colleagues in other West Coast cities today about how they overcame those challenges and what the results have been so far. So it is my honor to share the dais with Spencer Gardner, who is the planning director of the city of Spokane in Eastern Washington, and Dory Hellyer, who is the development incentives manager of the city of Portland. And each of them will provide us with a couple of really important and cutting edge case studies that will allow us to better understand how we can use zoning, land use, and other state powers to better facilitate housing production for more people. And then following their discussions of their cities and what they've done, we will hear from Mahdi Manji, who is the director of public policy at the Inner City Law Center here in Los Angeles. Okay, so we have folks keeping us track of on time in the front here. I will hand it to Spencer. And as you all are absorbing this important information, please send your questions to our slido.com that we introduced earlier. What is the hashtag here? Intersections 2025? Intersections. I was at a transportation conference, in the morning, I guess, mentally. So InterActions 2025, slido.com. That's where we're sending our questions, and we'll be ready for you when we get there. Okay, off to Spencer. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll launch right in, just to keep it brief. As mentioned, I'm Spencer Gardner. I'm the planning director for the city of Spokane, Washington. I want to riff off of what Mayor Steinberg said earlier. He made mention of historic neighborhoods and the concern about fitting in with the historic character of neighborhoods. The work that we did, and we'll talk a little more about exactly what we did. I think in public policy, story is just as important as the logic or the debate about what's going on. So for the work that we were doing in Spokane, we really wanted to focus on a story. And the story that we told starts in the early 1900s. This is when Spokane was a very small village, essentially, and it had a growth boom. So between the years of 1900 and 1910, we added 70,000 residents to our city. That represented basically a tripling in size of the city. As you can imagine, that was probably, that's far more growth than we're getting today. We feel like there's growth pressure now. I think this period in the early 1900s was probably similar in a lot of other places. So the story we tried to tell was, what do we see when we look at that growth period that might point to solutions for today? And I have a map up on the screen here. This was a small study that we had done a couple of years ago to identify buildings that were multifamily buildings, more than one unit, and existing in zones that only allowed for single family homes. Over time, we had basically made them illegal, non-conforming, to use a planner term. And the point we wanted to make was the character of these neighborhoods is actually defined by the ability to build many different types of housing. Looking at a historic, whatever you want to consider that, a historic neighborhood, and thinking that single family homes is the historic character, at least in the city of Spokane, is actually ahistorical. The historical norm was that families moved in and built what they needed to have a house over their head. And sometimes that meant building a duplex so you could rent out the other half to a family member or to a stranger, and they would help cover your mortgage. For some people, that meant building a small 4 or 6 unit apartment building. That was the historical norm. And that was how we got ourselves out of that earlier housing crisis in the early 1900s. So we very consciously told that story. There's another part to that as well. I think you're all familiar with this history, so I'll run through it relatively quickly. But we know that at all levels of government, local, state, and federal, there was a conscious effort to tilt the scales of housing policy against housing diversity and choice in all areas for all people. That was again, a calculated decision. There's lots of reasons why maybe we arrived at that conclusion, most of them not good. But the point is that we are fighting against over a century of favoritism. And when you peel back each layer of the onion, there's always something else there that you need to attack. And that's one of the things we've learned in Spokane as we've undertaken our work. So I actually didn't know that Mayor Steinberg was going to lay down his challenge, but so I chose this wording beforehand. In Spokane, we decided to actually take the word crisis at face value. A crisis is something you act on immediately. When your house is on fire, you don't sit back and study, should I jump out the window or take the stairs, or maybe I should grab a few things before I go. Generally, you're just going to get out of the house, and then maybe you can reassess the situation. So this was a picture from a press conference that we held. Incidentally, you see some historic housing in the background. We actually deliberately chose a historic neighborhood to hold the press conference in, again, to tell that story. those are historically fourplexes right there in the background, right in the middle of a historic neighborhood. So trying to tell that story. So what we did, we took advantage of state law in Washington. I don't know how it works here in California, so your mileage may vary. We proposed what's called an interim zoning ordinance. I'm sure that there's something called a moratorium here in California. It's a common thing across the state or across the country. You've got a problem, you need to shut it down, so you adopt a moratorium. An interim zoning ordinance is like the flip side of that. So you get sort of a gas pedal to immediately push something forward in response to an emergency. So like I said, we knew that we had a crisis and we took it at face value. We proposed an interim zoning ordinance that would go into effect immediately to allow up to 4 units on all residential properties across the entire city. This was proposed in June of 2022, and it was adopted in July of 2022. If you know, I assume that things are pretty similar here. Planning in the state of Washington is built to be very slow and methodical. So the fact that we proposed this and passed it within a month is nothing short of a miracle. Again, we took the word crisis at face value and we moved ahead. So again, that program allowed up to 4 units on residential lots. We called it a pilot program. As an interim ordinance, it was only in place for a year. And our feeling was that this was our opportunity to engage with the community on these issues. One of the things that I've noticed when you talk about housing policy with people, when you propose introducing new things into their neighborhood, they tend to conjure the worst, absolute worst case scenario. By adopting our change in this way, people woke up the day after it was adopted and realized that their neighborhood actually hadn't changed. Now, it will change over time, but incremental and sustained neighborhood change over time is actually a good thing. That's a sign of a healthy neighborhood. So curiously, we actually had very little opposition throughout any of the work that we did. I'll come back to some of the permanent work that we've done, but that was our sort of quick strike solution. You may be curious about permit numbers. By the way, BOCA is that's the name of our initiative, Building Opportunity and Choices for All. I'm not always good at noticing acronyms. I was talking with Dory about this earlier. So we did have some jokes about BOCA burgers during the course of this pilot program. We had in 2023 alone, these are permit numbers from 2023, we had 50 units permitted under that program. And in terms of total number of residential units during that year, we had a little over 1,300. So to illustrate, this was not a catastrophic change in the building situation in the city of Spokane. We didn't see a flood of new units across all areas of the city, dramatically changing the character of neighborhoods. But it was an important change in our mind, and we've seen the fruits now in the subsequent years as we've continued to have record numbers of building permits come through, including last year, which was our highest number ever. Okay, so moving on from the temporary change, the interim zoning ordinance, we immediately undertook an effort to engage the community on this issue. And we had a very successful time with it. We reached out to people who we had not heard from previously. We worked with community organizations from across the city. We had a very aggressive outreach campaign to try to gather as much feedback as possible. Yes, we heard from the usual neighborhood groups that didn't want a lot of change, but again, the changes had already been made. And it sort of took the sting away from, oh, you're gonna ruin our neighborhoods, because everybody looked around and was like, your neighborhood's fine to me. It doesn't seem like it's all that different. So what did we hear? People tended to care more about the size and the scale of the building than how many mailboxes hung off the front door. Design matters to people. They wanted the changes in their neighborhood to be consistent and to feel like it was a continuous neighborhood. We also heard from a lot of people, and everyone had their own story, their own housing journey. And that was really important because it highlighted that one of the gaps was not so much the volume of housing, although that was a problem. It was the fact that most neighborhoods had one option for housing, and that was it. There were no other options. And if I'm reaching retirement age and I'm looking to downsize, my choice is to stay in my house that's way bigger than I want or need and that I don't want to keep up, or to leave my neighborhood and leave my neighbors and give up on that part of my life entirely. That's a false choice, or it's a true choice, but it's an unnecessary choice that we've created now because of the way that we've built our neighborhoods over the last 100 years. Again, pointing back to those policy solutions. So our new regulations were focused on regulating the structure rather than the number of units. We also, in the city of Spokane, we regulate density, or have regulated density very strictly. We loosened those regulations for smaller developments. And the goal was for those infill development projects, the primary question for a developer is no longer, okay, what does the code tell me as far as how many units I can build? And then I'm gonna just maximize for that and then do everything else around, how many units I can get. We instead wanted developers to be asking the question, what does the market need here? And how can I serve that in my project? So removing the calculus for density kind of turns that question on its head and allows the developers to think more about the market and what it needs. So this is just a quick illustration of scale versus density. I think Mayor Steinberg hinted at this. So we no longer limit the number of units on most infill lots in the city. And instead, you have an envelope that you build in, and you put whatever you want in it. Could be multiple units, could be a single family home. The other big change that we made was what in Washington we call unit lot subdivision. The idea here is to allow for smaller lot sizes and smaller homes, and to allow for creating lots in situations that are traditionally very hard to do so. So infill lots, especially vacant infill lots, tend to be vacant for a reason. They're hard, the shape is weird, or there's some infrastructure issue, or there's something about the land that just makes it hard to develop. Unit lot subdivision grants the developer the ability to create lots in creative ways that our code doesn't necessarily foresee. So you can have lots, for example, that don't abut the street. You can have lots that are way smaller than our minimum lot size. And we made our minimums actually very small as part of our permanent work. So you can basically have a lot that is directly wraps right around the building. You can have oddly shaped lots. You can have lots that don't meet a width or a depth standard. The idea is that I'll get into planner technical stuff. In the unit lot subdivision, you have a parent lot, which is the lot that the developer starts with. And that lot does have to meet certain standards about setbacks and sizes and things like that. But the child lot, any child lot created from that parent can then deviate from those standards. So again, it was providing more flexibility, and it also provides home ownership opportunities. That was another important one for our city council. They recognize the value of apartments being built in neighborhoods, and we recognize that not everybody needs or wants to be a homeowner, but it is important also to recognize that that is a huge part of building wealth and security here in the United States. And so providing for flexible ways to attain home ownership is really important. There's another aspect here, which is sort of Washington specific, which is that condominium law in Washington is especially difficult, and condominiums are effectively not viable in our part of the state. I think I'll end it there, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards, but that's the end of my part, and I'll advance here.
Awesome. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Spencer. Dory Hellyer.
Good morning, everyone. In the city of Portland, we, as part of the state of Oregon, were one of the last 2 states in the country to lift the ban on inclusionary housing programs, Oregon and Texas. So obviously it took us a number of years, a lot of collaboration, a lot of lobbying from all sides. We've talked about here already what the development community needs to make money to get that rate of return, and all the different mission-driven lobbyists too, that took many, many years and many sessions at the state to figure out the right balance for our inclusionary housing program. In doing so, they finally lifted that ban in 2015. The city of Portland then pretty quickly adopted a program in 2016, and to date are the only city then in the state of Oregon that is actively administering an inclusionary zoning or housing program. This program went into effect in 2017, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that journey has gone, what changes we're still making as we live and breathe this program and implement it, and some of the lessons that we've learned along the way, and how this has and hasn't fit into, frankly, the overall housing continuum of the need for affordability. So the state sideboards of the law basically established some standards as to how this was going to be implemented. One of those standards was that was negotiated essentially was that the inclusionary zoning could not apply to any buildings with less than 20 units. So that meant we weren't going to see it in single family developments, that sort of thing. That was a priority that ended up being our law in the state of Oregon. There was also the requirement that no more than 20% of any of the units in one of those new buildings could be made subject to inclusionary housing, would have restricted income, sorry. And with that, we also could not restrict those units at more or less than 80% of median family income. And that was pretty much it. Those are the main things, except that there was a mention that we, as an adopting jurisdiction, would need to provide some form of offsets, didn't say how much, in direct financing, some form of tax exemptions, other fee waivers in order to help offset the cost of the reduced rents in these inclusionary units. It also mandated that any program adopted would provide an alternative option for a developer to pay a fee in lieu of providing the affordable units. There's no standards on what that would be, how that would look. So within the city of Portland, we had some additional policy framework that our city council implemented. They wanted to make sure that any inclusionary units remain affordable for up to 99 years, so effectively in perpetuity. They wanted to make sure that it was a citywide program, that we'd need to calibrate the inclusion rate and the different incentives that are provided, because across the city, on geography, on where costs are different or rents are different. And they also wanted to provide lots of options, which as an implementer of such programs was the bane of my existence. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. But it was, again, one of the things that developers wanted was flexibility. So would there be a way to take units that were to be meant in one building, consolidate multiple buildings' responsibilities into one? Would there be a way to partner with traditional affordable housing developers in that way? So that was an option. And we looked at more of sort of the need within the city of Portland, and the need exists below 80% of median income. I'll show you a little bit about some of what that need is in a minute with some data. But we recognize that there was more of a gap at that 60% of median income level, and even more of a gap for deeper affordability. But we realized that inclusionary housing was not going to be the program that would meet those deepest affordability needs. We're not going to be building units in otherwise market rate buildings that have permanent supportive housing and the services and things that are needed for lower income communities. And we decided also that although we were going to develop, implement the fee in lieu, we wanted to make sure that this fee in lieu was not the preferred choice. Some cities have opted to just make that the easy route out. The fee in lieu does provide for income that we can use for our traditional gap financing that the city uses to get to those lower income units. So it's a good option for us still, but we wanted to get units built now when they're getting built and have them built within otherwise market rate buildings that are in high opportunity areas, access to transit and good schools, and not have to wait for that development to happen later. The other thing that the city council decided to do was to then not just it was a last minute amendment at council. So one of the commissioners decided that they wanted to prioritize family size units. We all know there's a greater need for family size units, particularly with lower income families. So they said if a developer were to provide the same percentage of units, but breaking it down by bedroom size, they would actually be able to provide fewer units. Kind of a fun math exercise. But if they were to make them 2 or more bedrooms. So that was another wrinkle we added to it. But the biggest thing was to make sure that we did not have a difference in the units that low to moderate income families were living in or households. So we needed to make sure in our program development that the inclusionary units were not different in size, in quality, the bedroom count mix, where they're located within the building. So we implemented a number of different percentages and ways of trying to make sure that there weren't a difference in those units. So we had a bunch of choices to make as to what offsets and what balance of things we would do. When we rolled out the program, we had a very aggressive, quick public process. We had a stakeholder group. We hired an economist. We looked at what the cost of construction was at the time, what the impact of the reduced rents would be, and tried to balance the existing incentive programs that Portland already actually had a pretty rich suite of programs available. And we'd had mixed success with using these as voluntary programs rather than the mandatory inclusionary programs. One of the biggest things that happened at the same time as we rolled out the program was to evaluate first, increase our height and density bonuses available, increase the amount of floor area ratio that could be achievable in buildings complying with inclusionary housing. And we also, and this was a planning choice, of course, at that point, reduced some of the other ways to get these bonuses. Made it less, where there used to be a whole suite of different options of ways to achieve the bonus. The main one was going to be affordability. That was the priority. It was that conscious choice. We already had an existing tax exemption program that's been around for quite a while. It's a 10-year exemption. And in this case was when one of those geographical choices was made. We looked at the cost within the central city of Portland, where there's steel and concrete construction, a lot higher cost, and determined that a full property tax exemption, meaning that all of the units in the building would receive the tax exemption for those higher cost construction types. Outside of the central city, it was determined that we would only extend the tax exemption on the affordable units within each building. So obviously a much less valuable tax exemption. We also have an exemption of our impact fees, so system development charges, also for those units that are a restricted income. And this is one of those places where our existing program already had that limited to units restricted at 60% of median income or below. We kept that, didn't make a change to that to help, again, prioritize the 60% units. We also had implemented in 2015 a new construction excise tax in order to get funding for affordable housing development, and determined that we could do an exemption of that as well. We also, so by prioritizing the 10% or 60% AMI units, we decided to, as an option, whereas the state said we had to make couldn't require more than 20% of the units restricted to 80%, we provided an option and said if you could comply by providing 10% at 60%. And as an effect, I'll talk about how that kind of worked out. But leading into inclusionary housing, it went into effect in 2017. This is a display of our permitting activity over the last several years. It went up significantly because a lot of people were scared. Frankly, our pipeline was the highest it had been maybe ever of multifamily development, of people trying to avoid inclusionary housing just because of the unknown. And with that, we still, though, you can see, although we had to climb down from that high, we still had pretty good pipeline of activity, even with inclusionary housing. But it took a while for people to become comfortable with the program, to become comfortable with the additional legal documents that we inevitably had to sign for this 99-year affordability agreement. And then 2020 hit. Everyone knows that effectively killed development due to many reasons. And then we had a study lined up to review the program and determined that we couldn't use the money for that. We needed to use it for rent assistance. So we didn't evaluate the program for another couple of years. And it actually was good that we waited a couple of years because it gave us more to look at. As far as the program results, we've seen almost 2,000 units become restricted at that 60 to 80% level in over 251 projects. The majority of those are weighted at that 60% of median income. So the program requirements we made we're working. We have a pipeline of additional units coming through. When we did our calibration study, we looked at and determined a number of things. We were seeing units all over the city. We only had seen one project pay the fee in lieu, so we were getting them developed on site. And we had actually found that many buildings under 20 units had actually opted in order to get some of the density and height bonuses. And from there, we wanted to compare IH programs with other cities. We reviewed our development outcomes. We ended up having to do a pretty significant market analysis just because things had changed so much to see what it really was costing to build. We looked at pure cities. We looked at primarily cities on the West Coast, as well as like Austin, Denver, similar sized cities, and looked at different policies. We learned that there was a predominant number of buildings with less than 20 units, but they weren't necessarily being underbuilt. We wanted to make sure that was sort of a misnomer, that everyone's just building less than 20 units. And we had a couple of outlying projects where there were, multiple buildings with 20 units or less than 20 units. It certainly did happen. But we also found that we were mostly able to offset the cost of the reduced rents with our incentives. But we found that within the central city, where we had was most balanced, where there was that full tax exemption, we did end up, as you can see on the map here, the central city is the kind of light tealy blue in the middle, that actually the blue areas, the darker blue, were having rents more comparable to those in the central city, and we're having trouble. We're below the balancing of what our incentives could provide. So we actually extended our tax exemption out to those additional areas in order to provide the full tax exemption rather than just on the affordable units. And we actually had, from that change, it's just been, a year now, about 31 projects that were in our pipeline. Some of those had stalled, some of them were underway, but either changed their option from the 80% of median income to the 60% of median income option to receive this full tax exemption, or actually were able to move forward when they weren't before. It was just enough to help get their projects moving forward. We are going to reevaluate the program in 2027. We do acknowledge, and I've heard already, condo development is tough in Oregon too. It's not really happening. This has really only been working on our rental developments, and we want to see more of that. But we can say a relatively balanced inclusionary housing program is one way to increase the number of restricted income units and contribute to the continuum of housing. Our direct financing is scarce, and we have to target that towards our deeper affordability and where there's that greatest need and where the targeted services can be provided. And this is one way to meet that continuum. So thank you.
Oh, so young. Now we're going to hear from Mahdi Manji of the Inner City Law Center in Los Angeles to offer some reflections on what this might mean for Los Angeles.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Mahdi Manji. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Inner City Law Center. We're a nonprofit law firm based in Skid Row in downtown. We serve folks who are homeless and at risk of homelessness throughout LA County. So I want to start, with a little bit of a context. In 1871, mobs lynched 19 immigrants in Los Angeles in the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre. Rioters climbed to the rooftops of buildings where Chinese immigrants resided, used pickaxes to puncture holes in the roofs, and shot at people inside. Those who fled outside were shot at gunmen on the roof. Many were also beaten and tortured. And so that's the context in which LA's 1908 ordinance creating residential districts in which laundries and wash houses were prohibited. The prohibition against laundries had a racial component, since many of these shops, many of these businesses were owned by Chinese residents and citizens. So, the city of LA is one of the first cities, if not the first city in the country to adopt a zoning ordinance. And it's the history of that zoning ordinance is very much connected to the race and sort of discrimination of immigrants in the city. Again, going towards a little bit further towards 1926, the Supreme Court in Euclid v. Ambler describes apartments as destroying neighborhoods. And I'm quoting here, the apartment house as a mere parasite. That's the language from the Supreme Court in 1926. And then right after World War II, ends, and we have a second mass migration from the South. African Americans began leaving the South and going north and west. And that's around the time that LA implements widespread single-family zoning. Shortly after, in the 60s, Los Angeles passed, California actually passed Proposition 14. First, California passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act to prohibit housing discrimination. The voters promptly passed Proposition 14 to overturn the Rumford Act. This was later overturned by the California Supreme Court, and this issue was somewhat settled in 1968 through the Fair Housing Act, which bans discrimination by race. The voters in LA responded by passing Measure U to enact restrictions on density and on height. This year, you'll see the redlining map of the city of LA. I think it goes without saying that the core factor here when it comes to zoning and land use in the city of Los Angeles has been making sure that communities stay segregated, and it continues to be the case today. In the interim periods, we saw that in the 70s, the city of Los Angeles proposed a number of plans to expand density across the city and to create housing throughout the city. This is a plan from the 70s, the 1970 comprehensive plan, which was rejected, tried to create nodes of density throughout the city. Unfortunately, this was a plan that was rejected, and instead Measure U was adopted many years later. Instead of sort of the broad approach of building housing around the city decided to adopt what the process we currently still use today, which is the community plan process. 35 separate community plans where each community developed its own zoning and land use. And Professor Greg Morrow at UCLA sort of has done a great research report on this, 671 pages. If you're interested on this, each of one of the community plans and what happened in each one of those communities. And the broad summary is, in wealthy communities, residents organized to downzone their neighborhoods to ensure that mixed income multifamily housing was not built. And the opposite happened in low-income communities. The city had to, the growth machine still had to coexist, and housing still had to be built. And so where was that housing built? By and large, that housing was built in low-income Black and brown communities. This here we see sort of the zone capacity of the city of Los Angeles. And right after the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, you kind of see this massive drop where the city of LA, substantially reduced its zoning capacity from as much as 10 million up in 1960, all the way down to around, a low point of around 3.9 in 1990, at which point it starts going up again. This has had a massive impact on the cost of housing in the city of LA. In Los Angeles, the median home price in 2024 inflation adjusted dollars in 1962 was $197. That's $197,000. That's inflation adjusted in 2025 dollars. And so in 2025, now the median home price in LA County is closer to $880,000. In 1966, median home prices in LA were around 3.5 times the median household income. By 2024, we're now close to 8.7 times. And so we've really seen the impact of dramatically reducing the zoning by increased housing costs and housing taking a larger portion of our incomes. Going forward, we have, since the 90s, again, big changes in the city of LA. This is kind of that final uptick where you see the housing going up just a little bit, the zone capacity going up just a little bit. And so the first thing you kind of see is in 1999, LA's passing an adaptive reuse ordinance. This has been mostly used primarily in downtown to renovate some older buildings, much of older commercial and industrial stock, and bring it into modern housing. And then we really start seeing the state jumping in around 2016. We first see them in the sixth RENA cycle, which is sort of broadly the methodology which the state uses to require cities to plan and zone for housing. We see the state coming down and really trying to implement and enforce planning and zoning laws. And in 2016, we see the state passing SB 1069 to really get ADUs going. And from there on, we start seeing some progress. We see Measure JJJ and the creation of the LA TOC program. We see the pass of its SB 9, and then we start seeing in our current RENA cycle, in our current zoning cycle, an effort to really make some shifts. And so in 2022, LA embarks on an effort to rezone the city to make 252,000 new homes feasible. Part of this, as part of this process, they conducted polls to see where the city was, to see where the voters are. And they found that the vast majority of respondents expressed support to increase housing throughout the city, especially including in single family zones. The 2020 city poll that's referenced here found that 65% of LA residents wanted to build housing near transit, including in single family zones. Another poll from 2019 found 62% of Californians wanted to build housing near transit. And 61% of Californians were willing to cut cities' local transportation funds if they refuse to do so. This is interesting because, again, to some extent, these shouldn't be that surprising. 63% of the city of LA are renters. 63% of the city is renters. And we know that when there's a housing shortage, that causes rents to rise, and that causes our households to be displaced. So then we see with the city of LA, in their final housing element, they proposed, I think, somewhat a revolutionary plan to begin studying undoing this past 120 years of segregation. And so this is an objective here to affirmatively further fair housing and examine the land use practices that perpetuate this. Again, this is from the planning and the housing element approved by the city, to examine the land use practices that perpetuate racial exclusion and inequities, including but not limited to single-family zoning, low-density zoning, minimum lot size requirements, location of noxious uses, and subjective design review. This is from the city of LA. This is their promise to us. And unfortunately, promises are not kept often. So we see, as the city begins its rezone process, one of the first things that happens is around July 26th, the planning department decided to exclude all single-family zones from the incentive programs, which they primarily use to rezone. The public does not find out about this until October 26th. And after that, many of us began to start organizing and start reaching out to members of the council, members of the planning department to begin to remedy this. We're seeing here that this is a map of the city of LA, right? The vast majority of the land in the city, 74%, is set aside for single-family zoning. And you'll see this is a map of where development has happened in the last RHNA cycle of the last 10 years, almost entirely in the neighborhoods immediately west of downtown. This is a map here again of sort of the racial and ethnic demographics in the city of LA. The city where we've continued to use zoning as a method to preserve segregation. And some council members expressed that this issue hadn't been studied enough. But back in 2020, our Mayor Garcetti created a whole design competition to study what fourplexes, fiveplexes, sixplexes might look like. So these are a bunch of design that came out from that. So I want to close on sort of a hopeful note. I think we've made a great effort here. The city, the people of the city have shown that this is what we want. But unfortunately, the city council and the mayor have not gotten there. We know these are difficult choices. Ending 120 years of segregation is not easy. It requires a lot of challenges. I want to thank our friends here from Spokane and Portland coming here and telling us about the lessons they've had here. And I hope one day, not too far in the future, we're able to come back here and talk about the victories we've had in LA. And it's not going to be an easy fight. But I thought I'd put here a couple quotes just from leaders, because I think right now we need a little bit of leadership. One of the things that some of the council members told us is, there's not a consensus. MLK told us the genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. We understand this action is not easy, right? We're trying to undo segregation. It's not easy. The courage, again, MLK is one of those people, he had premonition of the future, right? And he tells us courage faces fear and thereby masters it. He tells us we must build dikes of courage to hold back the flood of fear. And so I want to end with this right here. Right? The time for action is now. It's never too late to do something. It took 100 years for us to get to this point. And I hope it doesn't take us another 100 years for us to say we have successfully desegregated the city. So thank you, everybody, for
Thank you so much for that, Mahdi. And I am sure we have a robust set of questions in our Slido queue, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and ask a question of both of our visitors from other cities first. And I'll ask both of them at the same time for efficiency, and then you each can answer in turn. So, thinking about drawing lessons for Los Angeles in particular, or other cities, first, Spencer, you talked a lot about capturing, or you did, I think, a really good job in capturing what you understood to be the community input, the community preferences when it came to ameliorating some of their concerns about, upzoning and new housing. So my question to you is, what was your process for obtaining that community input? I think that's, an erstwhile challenge in planning generally, and in Los Angeles in particular, where, we often, one of the reasons why I think you see that nosedive of zoning capacity in the 1980s and the 70s and 80s here is the homeowner voice became very, very strong. And so, some of the development patterns that you see in Los Angeles that Mahdi showed us, really is about kind of that disproportionate input that we get from, higher income communities and communities that are, filled with homeowners. So, my question to you is about, community input. And then, Dory, if you can, one of the, really unique things about Oregon and Portland is the urban growth boundary. And, so for those who aren't familiar, basically, well, I'll probably better off handing this to Dory, but there's this boundary, past which, housing is not supposed to be built and commercial uses are not supposed to be built beyond those boundaries. And so, obviously the development pattern in Los Angeles and in Southern California has been very, geographically vast, right? And there is absolutely no boundary. We don't even treat mountains and deserts and fire lines as boundaries. So, we have that competing development potential between, the exurban periphery and the more desired, I think, for most of us, central city areas. So just if you can talk to that. So Spencer?
Yeah, it's already on, good. I hinted at this in the presentation, but for us, the pilot or the interim zoning ordinance that we adopted to us was a significant portion of the engagement. But following on from that, we held a series of forums with different community organizations and agencies from around the region. One of the things we wanted to avoid is exactly, I think, what you've identified, which is when you send flyers out to the neighborhoods and say, okay, let's all get together and talk about housing, who's going to show up to that? It's going to be people with time and effort and money, because the people without those resources are probably working their second or third job, or they're home with kids or whatever. So we felt like putting a focus on organizations was a way to counterbalance that. And of course, we still did the outreach to the general community. But by bringing in that more organization-based voice, we were able to I think, get a broader cross-section of the community and the views, because these organizations, they're on the ground with people who are actually struggling. And so they were able to really help us to understand those needs. So this was, not just housing organizations, but we actually did a roundtable for faith-based organizations. We did a roundtable where we reached out to other government agencies. So all of these roundtables were, I think, calculated to kind of counterbalance that.
Great, thank you. Dory?
All right, so yes, the urban growth boundary, of course, there's a number of areas across the state where those are set, and it's been accused of being one of the reasons why there's such a need for housing. We do, within the city of Portland, a buildable lands inventory on a regular basis through our planning bureau. And there is a lot of development capacity still within the city boundaries. We certainly do look at our zoning, both for single family zoning and, small plexes. We've had a similar zoning changes as to what Spencer's mentioned in Spokane, but also looking at, what are the underutilized sites? Where are there dilapidated or older buildings that could be demolished and built with higher use, with higher, with building bigger buildings, right? I've also looked at, rezoning different areas. A couple of the pictures that were in my slide deck were for big sites across the city that are, working both with our tax increment financing arm of economic development. Where can we, one of them was a former huge US Post Office processing center right in the middle of downtown. So that is going to be redeveloped. And we're using inclusionary zoning in that as just part of one of the tools to ensure that affordability is part of this amazing new big project that hopefully one day gets built as they figure it out in the current economy. You know, looking at the way that the state program was rolled out though, with 20 units or more only, for instance, having inclusionary housing apply has made it really difficult for other cities to embrace the program. Somewhat smaller cities don't necessarily have a lot of 20-unit buildings that get built. They don't necessarily have the department and local capacity to implement or even just fight to create exemption programs. A lot of the other tools that we already had rolled out within the city of Portland or even have more than a couple staff in their housing departments to be able to do the long-term compliance. I mean, we're talking 99 years of affordability. That's a long time to monitor rents and tenant income in projects. You know, we have just 2,000 units that we created. The city already monitors our direct financed units. So we have about 18,000 that the city monitors generally. So just in a few years though, inclusionary housing's adding another couple thousand. We have to really ramp up a lot of that. So trying to balance, you know, the good idea of an inclusionary housing program, and then what does it really become when we put that into place? Yeah, that implementation is super important. You can't just put the policy on the books. You have to, you know, really nurture it. Fortunately, you know, Los Angeles has a lot of development potential for 20-unit buildings and other size buildings, right? And I think, aren't we also right next door to a like big postal service building? You know, I hope they can't hear me because I hope the postal service lasts forever. I think it's extremely important, but as we know, this is a time where federal guarantees are changing very rapidly. I assume we have a whole host of questions. How do I make that happen?
Testing.
Oh, there's Aaron.
I will help announce in the back. So we have a couple questions. I think we're going to start with one for Spencer. And this one's from Jody. So Jody, if you want to raise your hand, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. This was originally for Spencer, but then I hadn't fully heard Dory speak. So it's for both of you, really. And congratulations. Jody Litvak, most recently of LA Metro, but no more. But it's good to see everybody. One of the objections we often hear about increasing number of housing units from the areas where they are is about traffic. Now, maybe that's a real objection. Maybe that's, you know, a tactic for something else. But Spencer, I didn't hear you really talk about addressing the concerns about traffic. Did that come up for either of you? And if so, how did you handle it?
I came to Spokane by way of Chicago, so the idea of traffic in Spokane is kind of a joke. Don't tell anybody back there that I said that. No, it didn't really come up. And again, that was, I think, partly the way that we achieved our changes. When it changed in a month and everybody looked around and traffic was the same as it always has been, it sort of took that objection away. I think on individual projects, we do hear those complaints, but the planning system in the state of Washington is really designed to foster the deliberation and address those concerns at the time that you make the zoning changes. And once you get to the project stage, the state really takes away a lot of the ability for individuals to object to projects. So it might just be a quirk of the state law in Washington, but at this point, even when those objections surface, there's not a whole lot that can really be done with them.
I can add a little bit to that. One of the incentives I didn't talk about for inclusionary housing initially was that projects complying could have reduced parking requirements. And that was, we actually had a couple of projects that opted into the program that had previously been vested through their land use applications that inclusionary housing wouldn't apply. Since then, though, the city has eliminated all parking requirements, taking much more aggressive approach that way. And
Yeah,
So-
let's go.
um,
Shoop approves.
certainly there's projects that are still, especially these 20-unit buildings downtown, they have parking, right? That's part of what the market is going to demand. It's what their investors will demand that they do. But it definitely has changed the dynamic, particularly in neighborhoods outside of the central city, where we are seeing, 30, 40, 70 unit, 100 unit buildings. And some of them have parking, but they are getting built in those transit rich areas and can have more density in those areas too. It is still a topic of conversation, definitely. Probably every neighborhood meeting has something in their agenda for parking.
Yep.
Great. We have a question from YH. Do we have a YH? Oh,
Yeah. You've earned it already.
So my question is that clearly there had to be political leadership for Spokane and Portland to really undertake the reforms they've got. And we know there needs to be political leadership in Los Angeles, including, I think the answer to a lot of these questions lies in Proposition U and repealing Proposition U and a lot of those similar land use restrictions we've got here in this city. So for the partner cities that we have, what was the political leadership that got you there, right? What did they do to really help you advance that agenda? And for Mahdi, what do we need here to make that kind of reform happen?
I think we had a different situation in Spokane, very different than here in a lot of different ways. The politics around development in Spokane are very different. It's still, I think it's a small town. I think people still see development as a good thing, as validation that we're a place that's worth investing in. So I think it was important for us to take advantage of that moment because there hasn't really been significant opposition to development that's crystallized in Spokane in the way that it has probably here. And I know in the state of Washington, areas around Seattle, there's just a lot more, I think, organized opposition to housing development. So kind of a different environment that we were working in. But it did take leadership, and I can't take credit for the work that we've done. Really, it comes down to our city council, setting the stage for that through a housing study that the planning department had done prior to me joining the city, in which they had laid out several proposed actions. And one of those actions was an interim ordinance, exactly as ended up playing out. And then when I started at the city, it became very clear to me that our council wanted us to move faster than we were moving, and that it was essentially city staff that had, for a lot of reasons due to history and bruising fights from previously, were kind of hesitating and tentative. And then when I joined the city, recognized an opportunity. So we had our housing work has been so far unanimously supported. The interim ordinance, the permanent changes. We also recently eliminated all parking minimums across the city, and that was also unanimously supported. So we've had a council that's just very supportive.
Yeah, I mean, obviously getting the political will at the state, first of all, was the biggest level to be able to implement a program locally. Portland is definitely known as a more liberal city, but there's also, our economic development thrives on development, and a big part of that being housing and multifamily housing, particularly in the central city, expanding out into all of our neighborhood hubs. And there, it was a very intentional program development to make sure that we did not prevent that force. I mean, inclusionary housing, thankfully at the time that it finally came up for us, we were in a bit of a boom with housing. And so we were able to look at, but there was that decision to not make a huge economic impact on development, to make sure that there were incentives provided. However, there was also the notion that it was and still is a housing emergency. And so when I mentioned that the other incentives for height and FAR bonuses, et cetera, were eliminated for the most part in balancing out affordability instead, there initially with our program, we didn't seek necessarily to make projects whole through these different incentives. That building housing in Portland in larger multifamily developments was going to come with the requirement that affordability be added, just the same way that green building is a requirement in different ways, or that any other policies that are attractive become just part of the cost of doing business. Now, that definitely was not popular to a lot of people, and inclusionary housing has been blamed for all sorts of things that have happened over the last few years to see our development pipeline almost diminish at this point. But when we did our recalibration of the program, we were able to document that inclusionary housing has not been the demise of development in Portland or anywhere else, that there are all the other factors of cost and interest rates and everything else that make it difficult. And we're committed to making sure that we do still analyze the program, make sure that there are incentives to help balance the cost. But we're never going to have it 100% right. But for the most part, we want to make sure that it's not an impediment to development, but just part of, again, doing business to ensure that right of housing is somewhat more prevalent.
A somewhat challenging question for me to answer, partially because if the answer was known very well, you'd have our planning director up here instead of me. And our planning director would be talking about how we passed this extraordinary revolutionary ordinance, the city of LA, that really reversed the last 100 years of segregation and moved us towards building affordable housing and mixed income housing in every neighborhood. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So you'll just have to bear with me and have me speculate a little bit. I think, I think that to a great degree, we're talking about zoning and land use, but at least when I think about LA, when I think about this, I think we're talking about a bigger question. And I think a bigger question is, can we build a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy? I think that's the question. And the reason why I say that is because
I think we did. Question is, does it endure? Sorry.
I think we're trying to do so. I think we're currently in the process of doing so, and I think there's a lot of pushback to that. Let's just be very frank here. It's much easier to say we're going to build a small apartment next door if you know the person next door is going to be somebody who looks like you. That's not the case in LA, and hasn't been the case for over 60 or 70 years.
Yeah.
The city of LA is a city that's around 27% white. It's around 50% Latino. It's around 10% Black, around 15% Asian. It's one of the most diverse places in the country. And so if you're building a new home right next to you, the likelihood is the person is not going to look like you, right? And maybe that makes you a little bit more mad that their car is parked right in front of your driveway. But I think that's the question we're trying to solve. I think what we're trying to say is, everybody, the city belongs to all of us. We have the right to live in every neighborhood, and more importantly, that everybody deserves, that we can build a city with housing for everybody. And so if I'm looking at how do we get there, I think historically in California, and maybe this is the case across the country, we've had quite a bit of sort of political cost for politicians who supported housing. Mm-hmm. But we have not had a political cost for politicians who have opposed housing. And so I think we need to increase the cost for politicians to oppose housing. Because, I think part of the problem here is, you mentioned sort of Portland's a state of emergency or treats it. The problem with LA to some extent is we've been in a state of emergency for almost 70 years. We've been in a state of emergency such that there are now 45,000 people living on our streets. And that number's been quite high for quite a while. Yeah. And to some degree, we've normalized that. We've been in an emergency for a very long time. Very long time. And so I think part of it is we need to kind of internalize this, that we are in an emergency. And when you're in an emergency, you need to take action. And I think, friend from here from Spokane mentioned, they acted quickly and fast. And just say, I do want to say that there have been times when we've done that. Our mayor came in to office not too long ago and immediately issued Executive Order 1. And we found that developers were willing to build affordable housing, 80% AMI affordable housing, at no cost to the public. Now, some people maybe complaining, yeah, most of these projects are just entitlements, some of them are not being built. Sure, 2,000 of them are being built right now. And that may not sound like a lot, but 2,000 units, when an affordable housing unit costs $700,000, that's $1.4 billion the public is receiving for free. That's not nothing. And then we saw the mayor realize that some of these projects were in single family zones, that some of the neighbors were upset, and they pulled back. They said, we're not going to do this anymore. And that's a problem. That's a problem. We need to make sure that our mayor knows that this is a problem. Again, we've had council members who said something along the lines of, we have a council member who mostly represents renters in Hollywood and East Hollywood. This council member told us, and this is in the public record, you can look at it. This council member said there's not consensus. This council member has Larchmont, a small portion of his district in Larchmont. It primarily represents the renters of Hollywood and East Hollywood. But chose to believe that the consensus needed to be there. But let's be honest, we're not always going to have the consensus. The folks in Larchmont are not going to willingly end segregation. But we need to make it too costly. And so I think that requires all of us to make an effort to call into our council member's office and know that if they continue to preserve this racist status quo, we will kick them out of office.
Yeah. I want to conclude with a question for both Spencer and Dory. There is a very different federal environment that we're all confronting in many aspects of our jobs. And, I just wanted to pose the question to you both, just to give us a sense of, whether some of the uncertainty or directives or changing political climate that we're seeing at the federal level impacts the way that you're implementing these programs and doing your jobs, or perhaps that the localized nature of what we do in planning perhaps allows you new opportunities to kind of, strike out on your own and, kind of build the city that you want to build regardless of that federal environment.
Tough question. I think as far as thinking about our zoning code and specifically these programs, we need market rate development to happen. And some of the decisions being made nationally, whether it's tariffs or other things, are contributing to making that difficult, or at least making people think that it's going to be difficult. Half the battle is being worried about the future, right? Especially when you're speculating, buying property, trying to get something development ready. And so, we've done, even before the current political climate, a lot of what we're calling regulatory relief things, where we're trying to balance the impacts of different regulations on moving projects forward through our development pipeline, anything to kind of keep development moving. But, we're at the tension of, should we use, whether it's federal funds that may or may not come anymore, or our tax increment financing, other local, we've had some bond levies that have helped support housing that are now expiring. They're all spent. Getting new affordable housing built right now is going to be really, really tough. Things like inclusionary housing are going to allow us to still get some level of affordability in any development that happens. But we're also facing, there's a big movement around, more what's called workforce or higher, up to 120% of median income. Frankly, the city of Portland, for home ownership, that makes sense. But most of the city of Portland, the median rent is set more at 80% of median income. So we really are facing a lot of decisions that we need to make about where our money goes, where our programming goes, where our focuses go towards, still impacting homelessness that is a real issue. And that whole continuum is part of what we need to address.
I'm not totally sure how to answer, I guess. It is a tough question.
Fair.
I think I had my slide with the onion and kind of peeling back layers of the onion. I think it's one of the problems I think we have in our housing market is actually a result of consensus at the federal level for a long time. That's not to defend what's going on currently. I think it raises different challenges, but in a way, I think we've had to move forward and just assume that the feds don't have our back, even before the current environment, because there are so many factors in the housing market that ultimately we don't control as a city. Interest rates, building code in the state of Washington is set by the state. Federal housing policy, I mean, all of those things, and some of them are good, some of them are maybe less good. But the point is, when we're acting as a city, we really just can only control what we can control. And that's been our focus. And I don't know that that focus is going to change now. I think it's really been the case all along.
Got it. Makes sense. All right. I've allowed us to go.